Joker is a warning of how a modern Western society will collapse. And today, this warning is more important than ever, because the movie accurately predicts how revolution will come about in the West. And judging by recent events, we may be much closer than we thought. To see what I mean, Joker gives us 4 clear stages of how modern society collapses, and what will be behind a major revolution in the West. The first stage comes when a society is no longer connected, when communities are destroyed and loneliness is the norm. And we see this in the first section of the movie. The opening shot of Joker starts with a mirrored reflection of our protagonist, Arthur. From the looking glass, we see a sympathetic man displaying a sense of sadness and vulnerability. A man who has to put on a public mask to blend in as best he can to the society that he lives in. And the movie shows us why Arthur needs to do this by giving us a window into his sad life. You see, Arthur has a job at a company named Ha-Ha's, where he works as a cheap clown. But he isn't the circus brand of entertainer. Instead, Arthur spends his time flipping signs on the street and doing other odd jobs. But one day on the job, while Arthur's doing his sign routine, a band of teenagers snatch it from him and run away. Arthur immediately starts chasing after them, but gets ambushed and hit in the face with his own sign. The group of thugs then pour salt on the wound by kicking Arthur while he's lying down on the concrete. It's in this scene that we see the first cracks in Gotham society, and the consequences of the lack of social cohesion. You see, no one bothers to try and help Arthur, even though it's clear that he's been treated terribly by the people around him. It's a mirror of life in Western megacities, and this is having a significant impact on Arthur's psychology. To understand this properly, we need to consider a concept called the looking glass self, a sociological term that describes how a person's perception of themselves come from how they think other people view them. This develops in a 3-step process that begins incredibly early in life. As children, we slowly tap into and notice how other people react to our behavior. Those reactions are then attributed to judgments about how we act. And lastly, an individual then forms a self-image in line with how they think others are judging them. Charles Cooley, the sociologist who first coined the term, thought that this process of socialization was what made people human. But in Joker, the whole idea of the looking glass self has been thrown on its head. Arthur's self-image is so terrible because he's been convinced by other people's actions that he himself is terrible. And this creates a positive feedback loop, where every time someone treats Arthur poorly, he mistakenly believes that he deserves it. And a negative self-image like this will only lead to a compounding hatred of oneself. And Joker is just so popular because there are millions of men like Arthur in our world today. Because our entire culture is creating a breeding ground for loneliness, despair, mental illness, where we're bathed in atomizing celebrity at all cost nihilism. A society that's rebuked lonely, despairing young men into thinking they're worthless, angry freaks who deserve nothing but contempt. The hordes of castigated men is symptomatic of a very deep problem in our society. This is shown in the next scene, where Arthur talks to his therapist and asks,
"Is it just me, or is it getting crazier out there?"
But unfortunately, talking to a therapist doesn't seem to be helping his mental health a whole lot. So instead, he tries to get something out of the session by asking for a higher dose of his 7 medications, but all to no avail. He tells his therapist that all he really wants is just to not feel so bad anymore, but finds no refuge in her cold demeanor. Arthur treads a long flight of stairs up towards his apartment where he lives with his mother. She is almost physically immobile, whilst also being mentally unwell, with Arthur being left to take care of her all by himself. Once the two have dinner together, they turn on their favorite TV show, Live with Murray Franklin. Arthur idealizes the host, so much so that he starts imagining what it would feel like to be amongst the audience. In his daydream, Arthur envisions sitting amongst the crowd and shouting out to Murray, who asks him to stand up. He starts talking about taking care of his sick mother, all to hear inappropriate chuckles coming from the audience. However, Murray immediately settles them down and relates to Arthur's story by talking about how his father left him as a child.
I lived with my mother before I made it, just me and her. I'm that kid whose father went out for a pack of cigarettes, and he never came back.
I know what that's like, Murray.
Murray's like a father to Arthur, and he invites Arthur up on stage, and the two share a reassuring embrace. The next day, Arthur returns to work and has a chat with his co-worker Randall before he starts the shift. While the two talk, Arthur mentions the group of teens who assaulted him, and Randall offers him a gun for his protection. Arthur's hesitant, but Randall insists, and so Arthur takes the gun. And right before he's about to leave, Arthur is told to stop by his boss's office. Once he arrives, his boss coldly reprimands him about losing the company's sign the last day.
If you don't return the sign, I I gotta take it out of your paycheck.
Arthur can only put on a phony, empty smile as his boss takes a cut from his wages to pay for another sign. It's clear that Arthur has nothing going for him. He has no connection to his work, he has no connection to the people around him, he is completely unfulfilled and washed with nihilism. And this is where the second stage of societal revolution enters the picture, the resentment stage. You see, Arthur represents millions of lonely men who have been trodden on by society. Each and every time they're put down, it makes them more and more resentful of the society that has rejected them. This resentment then boils under the surface, and it's clear in Joker that this exact process is happening to Arthur. It adds to the growing resentment within him, and every time he's dehumanized like this, it burns away more of his looking glass self. The loneliness and negativity that this creates in both the individual and the society leads to mass resentment. But what is resentment if not a lack of good communication? Our society has ignored Arthur and millions of men like him, but beyond that, the lines of communication have broken down completely. There's no outlet for men like Arthur, there's nothing left for them to turn to. In Michel Foucault's book, Madness and Civilization, he paints a picture that's strikingly similar to what we've discussed. He states that madness or mental illness isn't purely biological or a chemical problem, but is instead deemed so by the society of the time. Like in our age of cancel culture, where we've been taught that people who think differently are a danger to society and that they must be ostracized and bullied into silence. You see, there's numerous factors contributing to how a society perceives and labels individuals as mentally ill. But for Foucault, this has led to an overly simplistic view on madness as a whole. The practice of rejecting those who think differently has deprived people of the ability to interact with outsiders. And this fracture in dialogue leaves many people unable to talk about or even really comprehend the underclass's problems and the reasonings for their disillusionment. And this of course only leads to more loneliness and isolation for those living on the outskirts of society. Which is why the Joker holds a mirror on how a society that shames young men is in fact responsible for the consequences that this brings. A hollow, meaningless, synthetic culture that shows nothing but vicious hostility towards true expression and authenticity. And this lack of effective public dialogue is clear in Joker. Arthur is constrained by the clinical apparatus of therapy that has become his only place of solace from society. In his first scene with the therapist, it's clear that Arthur isn't getting any actual help from the system. He still feels awful all the time, and it seems like his medications aren't even doing what they're supposed to. What Arthur really needs deep down is friendship, love, and community. All the things that the radical atomization and breakdown of modern society destroys. Arthur has no one to talk to or any way to meaningfully express himself, and is tearing him apart. But as Foucault said, there's no dialogue with people on the fringes anymore, and that is what causes growing resentment in society, when huge swaths of men are completely detached from the world around them and pushed into the shadows. We see this in the next scene, when Arthur takes his anger out on a nearby dumpster by violently kicking it on his way home. But just as Arthur is about to take the elevator up to his room, he stops the door from closing after a woman asks him to hold. Introducing herself as Sophie, she's joined by her young daughter, and she begins making small talk with Arthur. This comes as a shock to him, and Arthur has trouble maintaining composure. After Sophie makes some joking notions about the awful state of their building, she mimes shooting herself in the head, and this little hand motion sends Arthur head over heels for her. You see, so far in the movie, Arthur's only meaningful connection has been with his mother, so when a woman shows him some genuine affection or at least treats him like a human being, this 180 makes Arthur immediately fall for her. But he isn't exactly in love with Sophie, since he barely knows her. Instead, Arthur is in love with the idea of what she could be. In Arthur's mind, Sophie is an image of perfection and safety rather than an actual person. She's the escape from Arthur's horrible dystopian life, and yet due to his anxieties, Arthur hedges his bets and doesn't talk to her any longer, as she could either outright reject him or turn out not to be the person he had imagined, because she is the only ray of joy to come into his dreary, hollowed out existence. And if he squashed that, he'd have nothing left. Because Arthur doesn't have higher purposes or goals. His life consists of feeling inadequate, feeling numbed on medication, living a boring existence, all so that he can seek relief from the tedium by intervals of pleasure. And these pleasures and joys are uncertain and brief, so Arthur has to grab any joy he can and drown out the realization that his whole life is futile and meaningless. And it's this sort of thing that actually leads to things like incels and OnlyFans. This phenomenon has grown immensely in the past few years, something that we haven't seen before in hundreds hundreds of years of history, and this is a result of a huge section of society being completely detached from the people they see on a daily basis. It's this loneliness and not having any goals that makes people do crazy things to nourish their soul. But these solutions are always only temporary. They fall through the hands. We see these solutions, we see these glimpses of pleasure as mere projections. In the case of OnlyFans, a viewer is merely projecting what they want to see onto a woman, and this is just a symptom of millions of men who lack any meaningful romantic connections. These men are everywhere, men who have fallen through the cracks of society and have been reduced to depressed hedonists. But of course, these solutions are never sufficient substitutes for real human connection, and like almost all pleasures, they end up leaving you feel empty inside. You see, all the factors that we've talked about contribute to the massive problem of loneliness, and this feeling gives way to a bitter hatred for the society that isolated them. And this is yet another way that resentment has been brewing in our society. Things like OnlyFans only compound the problem for these lonely men. And matching the real world, Arthur also seeks a parasocial relationship with Sophie and starts stalking her from afar. That is until she notices and stops by Arthur's apartment afterwards, questioning if he was following her around.
Are you following me today?
Arthur has no idea how he's going to get out of this predicament, and so he admits what he was doing. Although strangely, Sophie doesn't seem too bothered by all of this, and so Arthur invites her out to a nearby comedy club as he's been practicing his craft and finally has the confidence to perform. However, it all goes awfully. The only thing that goes right is Sophie being the only one to laugh in the audience.
Be a comedian.
Following this, Arthur's life only gets worse and worse. He's back to work doing a gig at a children's hospital. Everything seems to be going well until the gun that he bought falls out of his pocket while doing a dance. Now, a children's hospital really isn't the best place to flex your gun, and so of course this incident ends up getting reported to his boss, and once he hears about it, Arthur is fired on the spot. Even worse, Arthur's friend, the man who actually gave him the gun in the first place, throws him under the bus by claiming the firearm always belonged to Arthur. Distraught and with very little to lose, Arthur takes another lonely ride back home on the subway, wearing his full clown makeup. This is rock bottom. Arthur has nearly lost everything, and each day he's been treated more and more like garbage. His self-image is in tatters. His looking glass self is broken. There is nothing left to lose. Arthur is faced with a horrific realization that the routine and drudgery of his life, all the pain and fear, is leading to nowhere. His constant struggle for a better life was all for nothing. The belief in a future, better, happier life is now completely dead. So what else is there for Arthur if all his beliefs are officially dead? Well, that's when you develop a new identity, a new purpose. And in our real world, this is how more twisted beliefs begin to metastasize. And it's within these new beliefs that Arthur loses his own emptiness and loneliness. In fact, new political beliefs are the only thing that will give Arthur courage in the dark. And just like that, the Joker is born. After years of resentment, Arthur is ready to explode, and something is about to push him off the precipice. It all begins while Arthur is minding his own business, and suddenly notices a group of 3 well-dressed men harassing a lone woman. These men are rich yuppies, and they're using their power to exploit this vulnerable woman. It's a microcosm of Arthur's wider political views, and with the stress of the day finally reaching Arthur's head, he unintentionally starts laughing, to which the group of men take notice. Shifting their attention, they now start toying with Arthur, eventually transitioning to a full-on beatdown. But little do they know, the clown has finally reached a breaking point, and Arthur pulls out a weapon and immediately shoots 2 of them, and injuring the last one. High off the adrenaline, Arthur then makes his way to the stairs where the last man fled and proceeds to finish him. But contrary to what most might feel after taking the lives of multiple people, Arthur now finds a strange sense of peace, and he begins dancing alone in front of a bathroom mirror. Due to the victims being high-profile Wall Street yuppies, news of this quickly spreads to the top of Gotham's political ladder. One of the leaders, Thomas Wayne, aligns himself fully against this and labels those who oppose him clowns. But little does Gotham realize that this incident has lit a fire under the city. Public unrest is bubbling up to the surface, and it's becoming harder and harder to prevent. It seems like just like that, thousands and thousands of people hide behind clown masks. And these clowns aren't just thugs. They are the consequence of a society that has turned their back on the underclass. A generation of frustration, anxiety, agitation, and repulsion to modernity's supposedly high standard of living. A standard of living that solely comprises of a violent and complex stimulation of sense at every second of the day, causing the need for more and more violent stimulation. A generation that craves distraction, as many distractions as can be crammed into the shortest possible time, all while living a life completely completely isolated from everyone, with no attachment to their labor or society. It's becoming a simple reality for millions of these people that there is no longer a belief in the society that they live in. The binding traditions of the society they live in are no longer enough to fortify the destruction of their community and happiness, and so the only way out of their despair requires a complete revolution. Which leads us on to the third step of Western revolution: social unrest. You see, when a society and its habitats become too harsh, it pushes more and more people out of it, and when the loneliness and resentment get to be too much for people to handle, cracks in the society start to show, and the next scene of Joker gives us an insight into what causes this. It's shortly after this point that Arthur goes to see his therapist once more, and lots of what he says points us to another influential thinker on madness. R.D. Laing is a controversial figure in psychiatry, but one of his core theories matches what Arthur says in this scene exactly. Arthur mentions that he, quote, didn't know if he really existed, and you see R.D. Laing theorized that one of schizophrenia's underlying causes is ontological insecurity, which means not being sure whether you actually exist, and as a defense mechanism to this existential problem, the self fractures into multiple pieces. In Joker, we see this happen literally, as Arthur's life devolves into chaos and he becomes increasingly unsure of what's really happening, with his personality splintering into two, Arthur and his new identity, the Joker. But here we can see a change in Arthur. He seems to have confirmed to himself that he really does exist, and the reason why is clear. He has found proof from the chaos itself that he created. His first meaningful impact on society wasn't done by Arthur, but by this new Joker. And this process also happens in the real world every day in the form of political radicalization. Men who have nothing to live for fall into an existential crisis, and often the solution they find is ideology, whether that be incelism or political extremism. But all of these ideologies offer a destructive outlet for resentment disguised as a belief system. And if enough people get swept up by this new ideology, if enough people want to tear down the society they hate, it can directly lead to unrest, violence, and revolution. Sometime later, Arthur gets a visit from a couple of detectives investigating the subway murders. The duo starts grilling him, but Arthur is able to hold it together and get them to leave. Shortly after, he finds that his mother has been hospitalized because of a severe illness. Once he pays her a visit, he sees that none other than Murray Franklin is live on TV, making a mockery of his stand-up. And while it seems like Murray is going to cancel Arthur, he actually receives a phone call moments later inviting him on the show. He reluctantly accepts, but then suddenly gets a bright, twisted idea after hanging up. Instead of going along with the inevitable public humiliation, Arthur will instead send everyone a message by ending himself on live TV. This is how he shows how sick the society has become, and he will sacrifice himself to do this. And you see, this is the turning point, where the Joker begins truly spiraling into madness. Firstly, after talking to Mr. Wayne, Arthur soon discovers that his mother was never actually his biological parent, and that he had been an orphan this entire time. And he later learns through confidential documents that his mom regularly abused him as a baby and had cooperated with her boyfriend while doing so. The straw that broke the camel's back was the mention of a head injury that was the probable cause of Arthur's laughing condition. After this is revealed, Arthur makes his way up to the hospital and takes away his mother's life. Things take an even worse turn once Arthur visits Sophie in her apartment, who appears terrified at just the mere sight of him. Arthur attempts to make some conversation, but she responds by saying she doesn't even know who he is, because their whole relationship was just a delusion. Although fortunately for Sophie, Arthur is able to somewhat gather himself and leave without hurting her. By this point in the story, Arthur's self is truly degrading. Possibly the last good things in his life have dissolved in a matter of moments. The bitter truth of his real reality has destroyed his last self. All the delusions of his relationship with Sophie have crumbled into the ground. These constant blows grow Joker's identity, and it's this exact road that many incels go down as well. The process of radicalization is extremely toxic, with violence occasionally following in its wake. Societal problems like this lead to the horrific disasters that we see in the US. A generation of alienated, lonely men is one of the most dangerous things to society, and the Joker shows this, as Arthur gets ready for a spot on the Murray Franklin show. While making his way to the studio, Arthur begins dancing down the stairs, fully embracing the chaos that he finds himself in. However, he gets interrupted when the same detectives who questioned him earlier see Arthur and the scene he is currently making. The two move to arrest him, but he bolts to the subway station, even getting hit by a car on the way there. Once they will reach the metro, nearly everyone inside is wearing clown masks to blend in with the ongoing protests. Fortunately, this allows Arthur to slip away from the law, and in the process, the detectives start getting beaten up by an irate group of passengers. The rebellion is growing. All the branches of the government and society around them are slowly being destroyed, and after everything he's been through, Arthur finally makes it to the TV studio. He hides his true intentions by donning his public mask and begins dancing whimsically over to his guest chair. He's playing his role as the stupid, idiot, loser man, and after he takes a seat next to an elderly couple, Arthur plainly admits live on TV that he was the one behind the subway attack. He defends himself by saying that
If it was me dying on the sidewalk, you'd walk right over me.
obviously a well-connected and influential man like Murray Franklin isn't very convinced by these justifications, because he is the top of society, he is the elite, the status quo. He's the one reaping the rewards of this sick society, and Arthur has already made up his mind about what he's going to do next. So he asks Murray if he wants to hear another joke. What do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash? You get what you deserve, as he proceeds to air Murray in the face live on air. This is the final stage of revolution, the trigger. It's that one action that brings down the house of cards. For Arthur, this is the final release of all the pent-up anger and resentment that's been boiling up inside of him. A twisted catharsis to get back at the society that treated him like dirt. And this action is the final stage of revolution, where the growing loneliness and resentment of society hits a breaking point. When new political beliefs start, this makes Gotham a ticking time bomb. And the ending of this key establishment figurehead on live TV is more than enough to set it off. To all the millions of clowns, Murray is a personification of the society that has kept them down. And it seems to be that the trigger like this is seemingly the only step we've avoided so far in today's world. But we can only hope that these changes to our society are reversed before it's too late. As over the last section of the movie, we see the consequences of this revolution play out. Chaos ensues, with riots erupting all over Gotham, and in the back of a police cruiser, Arthur sees the sheer scale of the upheaval that he has caused, and it brings a smile to his face. It seems like Arthur is on his way to be locked up for life until a rogue ambulance crashes into the vehicle, killing the two policemen, with the protesters then carrying an unconscious Arthur out of the wreckage, and laying him gently on the hood of the car. After a few seconds, Arthur gazes round at the massive crowd that has formed. It's at this moment that Arthur no longer exists. His new identity, his new belief, his new hope for a better world has begun, and so he starts dancing in a similar fashion to before, as he draws a smile with blood across his mouth, and the crowd cheers seeing their messiah. At the end of the film, the Joker finds himself imprisoned in Arkham Asylum being questioned. He has been telling a psychologist his story, and begins laughing once it's all said and done. The interrogator wants to know what's so funny, but Arthur responds that she just wouldn't get it. Moments later, he steps out of the room, and the film ends on a hallway shot of Arthur walking towards a window filled with light, leaving behind a trail of bloody footprints in his wake. Just like in Joker, tragedy is all that awaits if we see this twisted course of events in our own world. Something must be done to stop these similar processes in their tracks, otherwise Joker could turn from a mere warning to a prophetic image of the future.